In my programme yesterday, I discussed at some length the fact that the decisions by the NATO leaders in Vilnius not to provide Ukraine with any kind of timetable or membership action plan, indeed, their statement that Ukraine would never receive a membership action plan in connection with Ukraine's long-term aspiration to join NATO, that all of this was a heavy blow for Ukraine. It, in some respects, puts Ukraine in a worse position with respect to its NATO membership bid than it was following the summit meeting, the NATO summit meeting in Bucharest back in 2008, when NATO invited Ukraine to apply to join join the alliance. Well, I discussed that at some length, but I also said that there were reports that there was a lot of information that, notwithstanding that we would not have a route map for Ukraine to join NATO coming out of the summit in Vilnius, it did look as if Ukraine would be provided by some sort of security guarantees, or there would be an announcement about the security guarantees that Ukraine would receive, even though, as it turned out, those security guarantees would not be provided by NATO or by NATO member states in their capacity as NATO member states, but by the G7 states, the G7 being, of course, a separate organization from NATO and supposedly an economic association, even though there is, of course, a substantial overlap between membership of NATO and membership of the G7, though the membership is not identical, because Japan is a member of the G7, but is not a member of NATO. Anyway, I waited for the rest of yesterday, looking expectantly for the announcement of these guarantees, and they did not appear. In fact, what we got instead was some kind of a statement that there would be a decision, an announcement, perhaps sometime next year, as to the nature of what these security guarantees would be. So I think we can sum up what Ukraine got from the NATO summit in Vilnius. It got a lot of words of support. It got lots of criticisms of Russia. And it got the upgrading, if that's the right word, of the Ukraine-NATO Commission to the Ukraine-NATO Council. And that, as far as I can see, is largely it. That's the sum total of what Ukraine obtained in Vilnius. Now, there was a great deal of acrimony. President Zelensky made it absolutely clear on the first day that he was deeply unhappy with the way in which the summit was going. There's that famous photograph which I mentioned in my programme yesterday, in which we see him glowering angrily, even as all the other NATO officials chatter and talk amongst themselves. They've all, not just metaphorically, but in that photograph, almost literally turned their backs on him. And he made all kinds of comments, and I said yesterday in my programme that there were reports that the United States was angry, that the US delegation was angered by what they saw as President Zelensky's ingratitude for all the help and support and money and military equipment that Ukraine has received since the conflict began. And in fact, we've heard an awful lot more since the summit ended, detailing precisely exactly how much acrimony there was behind the scenes. And it seems that the British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who has been perhaps Ukraine's staunchest supporter amongst the bigger NATO powers, essentially the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Britain. Anyway, Ben Wallace actually had to take Lukashenko to one side and tell him to calm down and to stop being so critical of the Americans. He said that apparently he told Zelensky that if he continued in that kind of way, the mood in Congress might harden further against Ukraine. And he even made the extraordinary statement that Ukraine, Zelensky, should not treat Britain and the United States as if they were Amazon, where you just go to a website, see what you want, press a few buttons, and it comes through the post. That's not how it works, and in fact, that's not how President Zelensky should expect it to work. And in fact, Zelensky did modify his behavior on the second day, but he did that in ways that seemed, at least to me, excessive. He was apparently in one program, or one broadcast that he gave, he expressed thanks for all the help Ukraine has got. Well, somebody counted them, apparently 42 times, which, as we say in Britain, that rather points to somebody protesting rather too much. It's clear that Zelensky himself is deeply unhappy with the outcome of the Vilnius summit meeting. There were announcements of more military aid from Germany and Britain. The United States has already said what it's going to do. It's going to supply cluster munitions. In fact, we've just received reports, as I'm making this program, that the first batch of these cluster munitions has now arrived in Ukraine. But Britain wasn't able to come up with very much. Some more vehicles, more ammunition for the Challenger 2 tanks, which have not been used on the battlefront, and of which there are some reports that the British are warning the Ukrainians not, in fact, to use them on the battlefronts. The British would find it very embarrassing if these Challenger 2s were seen burning on the steppe lands in the way that the Leopard 2 tanks have been seen. Anyway, that's what the British came up with. The Germans came up with a little bit more, 20,000 more rounds of 155mm ammunition. Depending on how many shells Ukraine is launching each day, if it's 3,000, as the Pentagon is now saying, that's 7 days worth. If it's 5,000, as others have reported, then it's 4 days worth. But it's hardly enough to make any significant difference in terms of the outcome of the offensive. There'll be more Marder infantry fighting vehicles, no more effective, I suspect, than the infantry fighting vehicles that Ukraine has already received. And of course, there's the promise of the Leopard 1 tanks from the 1950s and 1960s, capable tanks in their day, but under-armoured and heavily outgunned by the far more powerful tanks that the Russian army is now deploying in Ukraine against the Ukrainian forces. So it's clearly been, from a Ukrainian point of view, a failure. Vilnius has been a failure. And at this point, I think it's important to try to get some sense of what the Ukrainian strategy, the overall Ukrainian strategy, has been. which is, of course, they want weapons from the West, and they're getting them, but apparently in diminishing numbers. They want political support from the West. They want financial support from the West. They want all of those things. But ultimately, given that they are now in a conflict with the Russian colossus, a conflict which, in their more realistic moods, they might perhaps understand that they cannot hope to win. Ultimately, what they want is not just military supplies, but much more overt signs of military support from the West. NATO guarantees, or something that approximates to it, a promise that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, a promise that the West will defend Ukraine, and ultimately perhaps a promise that Western troops will enter Ukraine and come to Ukraine's rescue, even as the Russian army closes in. And I think we can now say, not with total confidence, but with more confidence that we have had for some time, that none of these things is going to happen. The United States, the Western powers, are not going to come to Ukraine's rescue in that way. And without the United States, without Germany, without Britain, all coming to Ukraine's rescue, it's extremely unlikely, to put it mildly, that Poland and the Baltic states will be prepared to march into Ukraine and to do it all on their own. So, given the military realities, given the overall balance of military force and military power and economic might, and the demographic factors as well, that also play into this issue, with Russia having a population multiple times bigger than Ukraine, and a very, very much bigger population of able-bodied young and youngish men who could be called up into the battle. Well, given that all that is so, given that Ukraine is not going to have the US and Britain and Germany and all the others riding to its rescue, I would say that alongside the US admission of a few days ago that they've run out of ammunition to supply to Ukraine, Vilnius is in effect the high watermark of the West's support for Ukraine. It's going to start to ebb away from this point, and Ukraine is going to be left largely alone as it gradually goes under before the incoming Russian tide. That's how it looks to me at the moment. Now, it should be said, this is not over, and in this particular type of conflict, it's never over until it's over. It could be that there's a sudden change of position in Washington, that President Biden and his officials, seeing a Ukrainian collapse on the horizon, will reverse course. It could be that the same thing could happen in Germany as well, these being the only two countries that have the means to make a difference to the situation on the ground. But I have to say, this looks much less likely now than it did a few weeks ago, or even a few days ago. And of course, the reason that there's been this shift of Western policy is because of the offensive, the failure of Ukraine's offensive. Now, I've discussed this at great length now in multiple programs. I've spoken about how Ukraine has been making repeated attempts to advance in Zaporozhye and Kherson region and in southern Donbass, south of Vuhledar, and on the Vremevki ledge, and also in the Bakhmut area, and how all of these attacks up to this point have been repelled. And I've also discussed how there was more attempts over the last couple of days to launch mechanized assaults on Russian positions south of Orekhov, in the dead center of the southern battle lines in Zaporozhye region, and how all of these attacks failed every bit as disastrously as the attacks that took place in June. There's been more pictures of burnt-out Leopard 2 tanks, more pictures of burnt-out Bradley tanks. One Bradley, as I've said already, has been captured almost entirely intact, or perhaps entirely intact, by the Russians. But now we're getting more information, and it seems that there was quite heavy fog of war about what was going on in the Bakhmut area. But now latest reports seem to confirm conclusively that Russian counterattacks, especially in the Klesheyevka area, this village to the southwest of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, which Ukrainians have been trying very hard to capture over the last few weeks, that the Russians have actually carried out successful counterattacks there, that they've pushed the Ukrainians significantly back, that they're in full control both of the village and of the heights behind it, and that overall the situation in and around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, remains firmly under Russian control, that the Russian defenses around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, have held. And there's even some reports now that in some places the Russians have actually advanced beyond the start lines that they'd reached, the lines that they'd reached in the fighting in May, when Bakhmut eventually failed, that the Russians have actually captured new ground in this area, particularly in places to the north. Still very difficult to get an exact picture, but that does seem to be the situation overall. So, despite claims from General Syrski that Bakhmut is under the fire control of the Ukrainian army, the reality appears to be that the Ukrainian offensive towards Bakhmut, towards Artyomovsk, has now been repelled, and of course there's still tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops in the area. They're still heavily equipped with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and other machines. But going back to that article of a few days ago in Corriere della Sera by an Italian journalist who visited this area, visited the area where this particular fighting is taking place, it does increasingly look as if the Ukrainian attacks in this area are being repelled, Ukraine is absorbing heavy losses, and that they're not achieving any breakthroughs or capturing any significant ground. So, that's the situation on the battlefields as far as the Ukrainian offensive is concerned. But what is now also becoming clear, and what will certainly have weighed a lot in the decisions and discussions that took place in Vilnius, is that it seems that very gradually the balance on the front lines is shifting from a Ukrainian offensive focused on Bakhmut and on the south towards a Russian offensive taking place not just in Avdeyevka and in Kupyansk and Liman in the north, but it now turns out also in the area of Vuhledar and Marinka as well. And there were reports yesterday that the Russians have made advances of around 600 meters towards Vuhledar, that the pressure that they're applying on Marinka is also increasing. Nobody seems to be suggesting that Vuhledar is about to fall or be encircled. So far, Ukraine remains in firm control of the place, but it does seem as if the Russians once again have the initiative in this very difficult battle that has been taking place in southern Donbass to try to wrest control of Vuhledar from the Ukrainians. And can I repeat something which I said some time back? If Vuhledar is captured by the Russians, then looking at a map, and I'm not the best reader of maps, but looking at a map, it starts to look to me that as if in that case, the prospects of any offensive carried out by Ukraine in the southern front lines, in Zaporozhye region, in Kherson region, in southern Donbass, become impossibly complicated. If Vuhledar were to be captured by the Russians would be positioned there on the eastern flank of any Ukrainian advance, and I would have thought that from that moment onward, an advance south by Ukraine in all of the places that we've been talking about becomes dangerous. That's my own view. Anyway, the Vuhledar fighting, I suspect, has a long, long way to go. But further north, in Avdeyevka, it does seem as if the Russian vice is indeed closing around Avdeyevka. This is a battle which has received remarkably little attention in the media in the West, even though it has been ongoing since March. But even more alarming for Ukraine, as I discussed yesterday, must be the steady deterioration of their military positions further north, around Siversk, in the area of Liman, and of course in Kupyansk itself. And yesterday I saw reports that Russian artillery is now operating, is now carrying out artillery strikes on Ukrainian military positions within Kupyansk itself, that the fighting is drawing very much closer now to Kupyansk. The Russians have for some time now been only 2 kilometers away from Kupyansk in various places, but it seems that they're now maneuvering to get into position to launch an assault on the town. It seems that the reports that the civilian administrators and many civilians are leaving Kupyansk is actually correct. It's true. And one can get a sense of how critical the situation is and how important the situation is in this area of the battlefields, from the fact that I have yet to see a single article in the British media, at least, that even mentions this fighting in the north. And that is suggestive, first, that the fighting is going badly for Ukraine, and secondly, about the devastating psychological consequences for Ukraine if Kupyansk and Liman, but especially Kupyansk, were indeed to be recaptured by the Russians, and if the Russians were to then press on and advance further west and regain places like Izium and Balakleya, which along with Kupyansk and Liman, they lost during the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the autumn in this area. So, a tough battle, no doubt. Russian advances, slow and incremental. But it is striking that even as Ukraine makes no progress at all on the front lines where it has been attacking and where it is purportedly conducting its offensive, it is the Russians who are making progress, who are advancing in the north and who are gaining ground. Well, I read a report which said that in some places in the north, the Russians have advanced 1.5 kilometers. Well, that might mean a lot or a little, depending on how important the ground captured is. But it does seem that in this case, we are talking about important ground. And there's been other reports, lots of other reports about another town which Ukraine has been defending, now having been surrounded by the Russians, that the Russians have closed off all routes to this place. Russian forces, I'm taking this from TASS, cut off Ukrainian supply routes near Novosyolovskoye in Lugansk. This seems to be more a village than a town. But anyway, it does seem as if the Russians are making advances there. I'm not entirely sure precisely where this place is. But anyway, the fact is that gradually, steadily, methodically, the Russians are advancing, even as the Ukrainians themselves remain stuck. So, what next? What is the West going to do? Well, there's been announcements, as I said, of small dribbles of additional Western military support. Ukraine is going to get its cluster munitions on top of that. There's now comments that Ukraine that will start receiving training for pilots to fly F-16s, that this is going to start in August in the Netherlands. Incidentally, President Zelensky had a rather strange meeting with Prime Minister Mark Rutte of the Netherlands. Rutte has been one of Russia's most staunch critics within NATO and within the EU. And he has also been an outspoken supporter of Ukraine. I would say that he is apparently on his way out, even if he has been one of Europe's longest-lasting leaders. He's been Prime Minister of the Netherlands continuously for something like 13 years. And he's become very, very much part of the European political scene. His government has, however, collapsed, apparently over an issue relating to immigration policy. I have to say, I have not really been able to understand this crisis very well, this governmental crisis in the Netherlands very well, but I get the overall sense that it was one that Rutte himself manufactured. He seems, in other words, to have in some way deliberately caused the breakup of his own coalition by making demands that his junior coalition partners agree to changes in immigration policy, which he must have known they would reject. Anyway, he's going to remain as acting Prime Minister of the Netherlands until November, but apparently after that he intends to retire, to leave political life entirely, creating great uncertainty as to what might happen in the Netherlands. And recent elections in the Netherlands have been won. These are local elections, have been won by a new rising political force called the Farmers' Party, which made significant inroads in local elections a few weeks ago. And I can't help but wonder whether it is the rise of this party that has caused Mark Rutte to decide that the moment has finally come for him to quit the scene, and that this is why he collapsed his own government and then took an opportunity to say that beyond that he intends to retire. Anyway, I'm not able to discuss this further because, as I said, there's an awful lot here that I don't fully understand, and Dutch politics, where there's apparently about 20 different political parties at any one time, is not always easy, as I've realised, for outsiders to understand. But anyway, whatever. He had a meeting, Rutte had a meeting with Zelensky. There was a rather odd exchange where Zelensky offered Rutte a cup of coffee, and Rutte rather oddly rejected it and waved it back to Zelensky and said, you know, you're in a war, you need it more than me, which I have to say I found a very odd thing to say to Zelensky, and I found the whole exchange rather strange, and it follows strange exchanges between Zelensky and Ben Wallace, which I've discussed, some rather strange and I thought rather unfriendly comments towards Zelensky directed at him by President Biden at a joint press conference. But anyway, nonetheless, despite all of that, it will be in the Netherlands that the training is going to be provided to the Ukrainian pilots to fly the F-16s. And the F-16s themselves will be supplied to Ukraine, but they will not reach Ukraine until next year, long after this offensive has run its course. And the Ukrainian pilots will receive about 4 months training, that's the word, which hardly seems enough to make them proficient in using this fighter jet that they've never had any experience using. There's no explanation about where these fighter jets, these F-16s, are going to be based. Are they going to be based in Poland and Romania? There's no explanation of how the infrastructure needed to support these aircraft is going to be created in Ukraine, how the runways are going to be brought up to the standard that is needed to operate these apparently rather temperamental planes, these rather temperamental aircraft. So a lot that remains obscure on that front. And beyond this, the word is that these are going to be old F-16s, F-16s that are at the end of their useful life, that are going to be patched together and refurbished and taken out of store and given to Ukraine. In other words, they're going to be of that same era, the 1980s, as the MiG-29s and Sukhoi 27s that the Ukrainians have already been using. It's unlikely that they will provide Ukraine with any important additional capability beyond that which they have already had and largely lost. So this whole F-16 story it is beginning to look, at least to me, as yet another cruel deception of Ukraine. It's been provided with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and training for its troops, which is never remotely enough to change the balance of forces in the war itself, but which could prolong the war for a few more weeks or months, but at the price of more Ukrainian deaths. And again, coming back to Zelensky and his angry appearance at the Vilnius summit, I wonder whether he's beginning himself to understand this, that both he and Ukraine have, as Professor Mearsheimer has so eloquently said, been led along the primrose path by the West in a way that will eventually end in Ukraine's, or at least the Ukrainian government's, the current Ukrainian government's, eventual end and destruction. Well, anyway, that's one thing that the Western powers are doing. They're still providing some weapons to Ukraine. There is a report, it's not very, it's not one that I would place a huge amount of weight on, but there's a report that President Biden, apparently in his personal discussions with Zelensky, warned Zelensky that the United States is looking to Ukraine to break through on the southern battle lines and to reach the Black Sea and, in effect, to place Crimea under siege by November. And if that hasn't been achieved by that point, then from that moment forward, support for Ukraine from the United States is going to start to reduce. Now, I don't know whether that is true. I wonder whether President Biden would have said it in quite such a brutal way. But true or not, in terms of what President Biden might have said to Zelensky, I suspect it is true as to what is most likely now to happen. Once this offensive has run its course, and I don't think anybody any longer seriously believes that Ukraine is going to break through the front lines and is going to reach Crimea, whether by November or at all. But once the offensive is over, gradually, incrementally, the United States will stop sending more supplies, or the amount of US supplies to Ukraine will start to reduce as the United States, as the administration, as the president himself become increasingly focused on the increasingly difficult challenge of achieving re-election next year. And what may make that challenge particularly difficult and may work against Ukraine even more is that there are now more and more economic reports starting to accumulate that suggest that we could be in a recession situation, certainly in Europe, quite possibly in the United States as well, at some point over the next 12 months, probably before the election next year. There's been apparently a collapse in money supply in most of the major Western economies. There's been steep falls in prices of certain goods, including, by the way, energy products. The oil price is currently rising again, but some energy products, falls in inflation that we're starting to see in the United States and other places, are being read by more and more people not as a sign of a return to economic health or of a resolution of the supply chain crises that racked the Western economies last year, but more as signs of collapsing demand for products, a sharp fall in manufacturing production right across the West, all pointing to another steep recession on the horizon. And of course, if that is the case, then interest in Ukraine and its war amongst the political leaderships is going to start to dwindle away. They will become far more involved in the much more serious and important issue of trying to secure their political survival. So, what happens next? Come back to this difficult question. Foreign Minister Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has just issued another statement in which he has again made it absolutely clear that Russia is not prepared to change its policies, that the Russians still expect and indeed insist that all of the objectives that were originally reached at the start, that were originally set at the start of the special military operation, that they all have to be achieved. And what Lavrov actually said is, our position has not changed dramatically. We are open to dialogue, but we will be guided by our legitimate interests and will balance approaches to a possible settlement with the situation on the ground. And he said that in an interview with the Russian channel Lenta.ru. So, Lenta.ru. So, no real sign that the Russians are prepared to compromise on their essential policies. And after all, why would they? Why would they be seeking compromise, given that the military situation appears to be shifting so significantly in their favor? But is there going to be any interest in the West on the part of Ukraine now in seeking compromise with the Russians? Well, President Zelensky, in theory, has ruled that out. He says that the only circumstance in which he's prepared to negotiate with the Russians is if the Russians withdraw completely from all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, return to their own 1991 borders, and then he is prepared to talk, though it's no longer clear to me what he's prepared in that case to talk about, since in effect the entire conflict will be over and resolved entirely in his favor. But that's the position that he is taking. And I think it is going to be extremely difficult for him to adjust his policies, to adjust his position, and to move away from that, given the vehement way in which he has endlessly reiterated it. It seems to me that if he starts to take that line, if he communicates to the Russians that he's now prepared to sit down and talk with them and negotiate on more rational lines, then Firstly, the Russians will come back and say that they don't really believe him. But secondly, the reaction within Ukraine itself will be extremely bitter, and many people will ask, why is Zelensky doing this when he could have had better deals before? And what did all those thousands of men who've died on the battlefields in that case die for? To be absolutely frank, I don't think that President Zelensky is in a position to open negotiations with the Russians. I think if a political decision is made in Ukraine that negotiations with the Russians are needed, then Ukraine will have to find itself another leader, and Zelensky himself will have to step down. So that's the Ukrainian side of things. But what about the United States? And one has to stress again always that it is the United States that is the only party in the West which is now capable of taking any kind of diplomatic initiative at all. Well, there are some people who do want negotiations, and the NATO communique didn't appear to close out that option entirely. It spoke about the need to keep channels of communication to the Russians open. And I've discussed the people I call the Washington realists, people like Richard Haass, Samuel Charap, all of these people, none of them, it must be stressed, members of the US government, but probably people who have some support within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, amongst the uniformed military, worried about the depletion of the US's weapons reserves. Well, some of them, perhaps, well, these people do seem to want some kind of negotiations. They've been talking about this for months. And possibly, just possibly, the CIA director, William Burns, former ambassador to Moscow, well informed about Russian thinking. He previously and fruitlessly advised the US government that as far as the Russians were concerned, Ukrainian membership of NATO was an absolute red line. Well, William Burns did have that telephone conversation with Sergei Narishkin, the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. He does seem to be able to maintain some kind of contacts with the Russians, the only senior US official able to do that. And though that conversation was supposedly about the Prigozhin mutiny, it's possible that it was all about Burns was trying to establish some kind of contact with Narishkin to create a framework for future negotiations. The problem is, again, that the Russians are most unlikely to be prepared to settle for any deal that the United States is going to accept. Because, as I've discussed many times, it is fundamentally implausible that the Russians will agree to any deal over Ukraine that doesn't commit the United States to a position where Ukraine remains permanently outside NATO. And President Biden has now staked his entire position on defending this supposed open door policy that NATO has, even though it's one that finds no place anywhere in the Washington Treaty. Anyway, I don't think he's able to agree to the kind of binding agreement with the Russians that Ukraine will remain indefinitely neutral and outside NATO. And of course, it would contradict commitments that he's made as recently as yesterday in Vilnius. So I do think President Biden can do that. And besides, the Russians are certain to insist on revisiting the whole issue of European security, of the security structures in Europe. And they will want NATO to be diluted. They will want all kinds of further guarantees. They will probably insist upon revival of the ideas set out in the two draft treaties they presented to the United States and to NATO in the run-up to the war in December 2021. And those are proposals also which the United States, it seems to me, cannot accept and will not agree to. So where does that leave us? Well, I'm afraid that with this particular administration, there is a real possibility that they will come to a decision, that a two-track decision. One is to try to keep the war going, at least in some form, until the November election, so as to prevent a total Ukrainian collapse before that point. And that might involve a certain element of escalation. We see that with cluster munitions. We see this with the F-16s. The ATACMS missiles might follow. But ultimately, from an intellectual point of view, they might rather cold-bloodedly say to themselves that if there is no other choice, better to see Ukraine completely defeated, taken apart by the Russians, broken, than reach an agreement with the Russians that will compromise on NATO's open door principle and revive the question of the security systems in Europe. And I have to say, reading all the things that have come out of Vilnius, reading all the statements, there have been more statements today by Lloyd Austin, the Defence Secretary, I wonder whether this is where we're heading. If so, what a disastrous, tragic, dismal outcome. Because Ukraine will not only have been led up the garden path, or the primrose path, as Professor Mearsheimer has said, but it will have been destroyed in the process, because the United States cannot compromise on maximalist stances it has taken that have no foundation in reality, because, in other words, it cannot talk peace. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. Just to remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. more from me soon. Have a very good day, and we'll see what more things are in store in our next program. Thank you again, and have a very good day.